All right, today we are diving into a concept that is, quite literally, the bedrock of modern democracy, the separation of powers. It's the invisible architecture, the blueprint that stops power from becoming tyranny. We're going to take a look at how this incredible balancing act actually works.
So let's start with the big one, the question that has kept political philosophers up at night for centuries. How do you design a government that's strong enough to get things done, but not so strong that it crushes the very freedom it's supposed to protect? This is the fundamental problem that the separation of powers was born to solve. Okay, so to get a handle on the solution, you first got to know who the main players are in this whole game of power. Turns out, in pretty much any government, there are three key branches holding all the cards. And who are they? Well, first up, you've got the legislature. Think Parliament or Congress. Their whole job is to make the laws. Then there's the executive, that's the government of the day. They're the ones who actually enforce those laws. And finally, you have the judiciary, the courts, who get to decide what the laws actually mean and make sure justice is done. Now here's where it gets really dicey. Imagine for a second if one person or one group controlled all three of those things, making the law, enforcing it, and judging it. That is a perfect recipe for tyranny, right? So the whole point, the entire goal, is to build a system that protects our liberty from the get-go, by design. So where did this idea, this blueprint for balance, even come from? Let's take a quick trip back in time and see how it went from a philosopher's daydream to the pages of actual constitutions. It all really kicked off back in 1748 with the French philosopher Montesquieu, who basically said this was the secret to freedom. A few decades later, in 1787, the brand new United States Constitution takes that theory and runs with it, creating a very strict division of power. Then you jump to 1950, and India, newly independent, looks at this principle and says, okay, we like this, but we're going to do it our own way. So what's the secret sauce here? Well, it all boils down to three core ideas. 1, each branch has its own unique job, its own lane. 2, and this one is absolutely huge, is the idea of checks and balances, where each branch can put the brakes on the other two. And 3, the whole point isn't constant fighting, it's about cooperation, so the government can actually function. And that brings us to a really fascinating example, India. Let's see how the folks who wrote the Indian Constitution took this blueprint and gave it their own unique, flexible twist. Yeah, this is a really key point. India looked at the strict American-style model and decided, nope, not for us. So instead of building these giant, watertight walls between the three branches, the Indian Constitution is all about a clear division of jobs, with mutual accountability baked right in. It's really less about strict separation and more about a delicate balance. And you can see these rules of the road spelled out right there in the Constitution itself. You've got articles that say, hey, the judiciary needs to be separate from the executive. You've got others that basically tell politicians you can't mess with judges. And others still that make it clear executive power rests with the president and governors. It's all about creating clear lanes for everyone to operate in. But, and this is the brilliant part, the lines are intentionally a little blurry. Think about it. The executive gets to appoint judges, which is a check on the judiciary. But then the legislature can turn around and impeach those same judges, which is a check on both of them. It's this incredible, intricate web of overlapping powers that makes the whole thing work. Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this all play out in the real world when things get heated? Let's look at a couple of landmark Supreme Court cases to see what happens when these powers actually collide. One of the first big tests came way back in 1955. In this case, Ramjawaya Kapoor versus State of Punjab, the Supreme Court basically laid down the law. They said, look, India doesn't have a super rigid, absolute separation of powers, but the Constitution for sure meant for each branch to have its own distinct job to do. And check out this key line from the judgment. The court said the Constitution hasn't recognized the doctrine in its absolute rigidity, but the functions are sufficiently differentiated. That little phrase set the tone for how this would all be interpreted for decades. And then, 1975, the case of Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan. This was a game changer. The Supreme Court did something truly massive. It struck down a constitutional amendment passed by Parliament and declared that the separation of powers is part of the basic structure of the Constitution. You can think of the basic structure as the untouchable, unchangeable soul of the Constitution. Not even Parliament can mess with it.
And that brings us to probably the most controversial part of this whole balancing act. What happens when the judiciary, the interpreters of the law, start to look like they're actually making the law? This is the huge debate over something called judicial activism. So let's be clear what we're talking about. Judicial legislation, or you might hear it called judge-made law, is what happens when a court's decision is so groundbreaking that it essentially creates a new law to fill a void, a gap that the legislature just hasn't gotten around to addressing. And wow, are there some big examples of this in India? Take the collegium system, the way judges are appointed. That wasn't created by a law from Parliament. It was created by the Supreme Court itself. Or think about passive euthanasia. That was legalized by a court ruling. Even the none of the above option you see on ballots, yep, that came from a Supreme Court verdict. So you might be asking, how do the courts justify this? Well, the Supreme Court's own reasoning is that sometimes the legislature just doesn't move fast enough to keep up with a changing society. And in those moments, the courts feel compelled to step in and fill that void, to make sure justice is actually served. They see it as a duty, not a power grab. All right, so after all that, where do we land? What we're looking at isn't some fixed, rigid machine. It's more like a never-ending dance, a constant search for that perfect point of balance. And if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that in India, the separation of powers isn't a wall, not at all. It's a living, breathing process of negotiation, of checks, and of balances. It's always in motion. Which leaves us with one last really interesting question to chew on. In this incredibly delicate and never-ending balancing act, where each branch holds the other in check, who do you think really gets the final say? Something to think about.